On the desk of the police commissioner of Poitiers lies an envelope without a return address, without a signature. Inside is a single sheet of paper. On it is one sentence. In the house of Madame Monnier on the Street de la Visitation, a woman is being held. The commissioner is in no hurry to act. This surname is familiar to him. Everyone in the city knows it. The Monniers belong to old families. Their reputation has been built over decades. Émile Monnier, during his lifetime, held the post of Dean of the Faculty of Letters at the local university. After he passed away, the house has been managed by Louise Monnier, a woman of strict morals and a regular parishioner of the Catholic Church. Their son Marcel has made a career as a lawyer and has long gone beyond the provincial level. This family donates to the church. Clergy are received in their house. In Poitiers, the Monnier surname has long been associated with order and trustworthiness. The content of the letter does not fit this image. The commissioner clearly understands the possible consequences. Any unjustified action regarding such a family will turn into a scandal. But he has no right to ignore the signal. He chooses the most cautious option: no publicity, a routine check, to make sure the alarm is groundless. May 23, 1901, closer to the evening, two policemen approach the mansion on the Street de la Visitation, a three-story house with closed shutters, a neat facade, the silence characteristic of an old district. The door is opened by an elderly woman in black, Louise Monnier. She looks collected and calm. There is no fuss or confusion in her behavior. The policemen announce the necessity of inspecting the house. Louise Monnier lets them inside without objections. They walk through the house step by step. First, the living room, then the dining room and kitchen. After that, they go up to the second floor, where the living rooms are located. Everywhere is clean. Things are neatly arranged. The setting does not stand out in any way from the usual way of life of a wealthy house. When the policemen go higher, one of them draws attention to a closed door on the third floor. It is locked. From it comes a heavy, stagnant smell, which is impossible to confuse with a household one. The policeman points to the door and demands it be opened. The expression on the hostess's face changes. It happens almost imperceptibly, but enough to cause alarm. She tries to stop the further inspection. The policeman approaches the door. The lock is not designed for force. The door gives way. He takes a step inside. The Monnier house was not a place where secrets were sought. In 1876, the family was at the peak of its position. Émile Monnier was alive and held the post of Dean of the Faculty of Letters at the University of Poitiers. His wife Louise managed the house and actively participated in the life of the Catholic parish.
In the city, they were perceived as an exemplary couple, wealthy, educated, and deeply religious. They had 2 adult children. The son, Marcel, was already studying law and was considered a promising student. The daughter, Blanche, lived with the family. Blanche Monnier was considered a good match: attractive appearance, good upbringing, a substantial dowry. She regularly appeared at balls, charity evenings, and church receptions. Young men from decent families paid attention to her. Their parents did the same. Louise Monnier treated her daughter's future with special seriousness. Blanche's marriage, for her, was not a question of personal happiness, but a continuation of family strategy. The position of the lineage in the next generation depended on whom the daughter would link her life with. Suitable options already existed. Several families from their circle showed interest. It was about unions that would strengthen the Monniers' position in society. Everything developed as was customary in such houses. Then Blanche violated this order. She fell in love. The chosen one was Monsieur Beauvais, a lawyer, a man significantly older than her and, what was most important, without a fortune. He had neither lands, nor capital, nor inheritance, only his own practice and reputation. For Louise Monnier, this was not enough. Blanche informed her mother of her intention to marry him. The answer was unequivocal. This union was considered inadmissible.
It threatened the family's reputation and crossed out plans built over years. Blanche tried to insist. She spoke of feelings and the virtues of the chosen person. For Louise, this conversation had no continuation. After that, Blanche continued the relationship secretly, through notes passed by acquaintances, through rare meetings in the city, which could easily be taken for accidental. Louise found out about this quite quickly. In a small town, such things rarely remain unnoticed. Rumors reached the Monnier house, and then the decision was made, without scenes and public conflicts. First, Blanche stopped appearing in public. To questions from acquaintances, Louise answered evasively, citing indisposition. Then she spoke of a nervous disorder. Later, she mentioned a trip to relatives to restore health. Weeks passed, then months. Explanations changed, but the result remained the same. No one saw Blanche. Monsieur Beauvais tried to figure it out. He came to the Monnier house, but the door remained closed. He wrote letters, but received no answers. Mutual acquaintances either knew nothing or preferred not to interfere. Over time, questions began to sound less frequently. The respected family was taken at their word. If they said the daughter had left, that was enough. Years went by. The name Blanche Monnier gradually disappeared from conversations. For the city, she simply ceased to exist. But in the house on the Street de la Visitation, life continued. Louise received guests.
Marcel built a career. The house functioned as usual, and no one, including people who visited here regularly, suspected that all this time Blanche Monnier was within these very walls, behind a closed door on the 3rd floor. 25 years is a period during which more than one generation manages to change. During this time, orders change, faces are erased, names are forgotten. And during this same time, a whole city can stop noticing a person who has not disappeared anywhere. Louise Monnier built this disappearance consistently and precisely. The first months were the most dangerous. Blanche was still remembered. People asked about her at receptions, after Sunday services, at chance meetings. Louise answered calmly and confidently. The daughter is unwell. Doctors recommended rest and a change of climate. She left for treatment. Versions changed in details, but the general meaning remained unchanged. Blanche is temporarily absent. The temporary absence stretched for a year, then for a second. Questions became fewer, but they did not disappear completely. The most persistent remained Monsieur Beauvais. He did not accept explanations, wrote letters, tried to pass notes through acquaintances, even hired a man to watch the Monnier house. Louise realized that mere absence was no longer enough. The situation required a final period. Then the version changed. Approximately 2 years after Blanche's disappearance, Louise began to speak of a severe illness, of an ailment that at that time was called consumption, a disease about which people did not ask in detail and which they preferred not to discuss aloud. She told this story selectively, to close friends, to the priest, to longtime neighbors. There was fatigue in her voice, restrained grief in her behavior. The image of a mother losing a daughter looked convincing. Over time, the story was supplemented with details: a special institution, constant care, a ban on visits due to the danger of infection. The city reacted with sympathy. The story began to live its own life, passing from mouth to mouth. First, the husband's passing. Then, the daughter's severe illness. For a respected family, this looked like a series of misfortunes. By that time, Émile Monnier was no longer alive. This strengthened the general impression. A widow with a sick daughter and an adult son evoked only pity. Then followed the last step. Louise appeared at Sunday service in full mourning. She did not explain what was happening, but explanations were not required. For those around, it became obvious that Blanche was no more. The news spread through Poitiers quickly. No one saw the funeral. Louise explained this by the fact that the ceremony took place far from the city, where Blanche had spent her last months. Modestly, without outsiders. The burial place was at the institution, where outsiders were not allowed. No one began to verify these words.
Interfering in the grief of a respected family was considered indecent. Monsieur Beauvais learned that Blanche was allegedly gone as one of the last. He tried to find out details, but the answers remained vague. Over time, he retreated. He had no other options left. The Monnier house returned to its usual way of life. Louise observed mourning for the prescribed time, then again engaged in charity and church affairs. At receptions, she appeared as a woman who had survived a loss and preserved her dignity.
Marcel, meanwhile, strengthened his position. His legal practice grew. He became an increasingly noticeable figure. The Monnier surname still opened doors. Sometimes neighbors noted strange details. Shutters on the third floor that never opened. Servants who changed too often and did not stay for long. Sounds at night for which convenient explanations were found. An old house. Drafts. Wooden floors. Years passed. 5, 10, 15, 20. Blanche Monnier gradually turned into a memory. Those who knew her personally grew old. Those who were born later heard of her only as the daughter of Madame Monnier, who had departed from life early. Louise grew old but did not lose control. She continued to manage the house, attend church, receive visits, and every day she went up to the third floor, to the door that remained locked for a quarter of a century. What was happening behind that door, only two people knew: Louise Monnier and her son, Marcel.
Servants received strict instructions not to go up to the third floor, not to ask questions. Any manifestation of curiosity ended in dismissal without recommendations. The system worked without failures, 25 years without rumors and checks, until May 1901, until the day when an anonymous envelope appeared on the police commissioner's desk. Someone found out after all, and after a long silence, decided to violate the order that the city supported with its indifference. The policeman sent for the check did not expect anything serious. An anonymous signal, without a signature, looked like someone's attempt to harm or scare. The Monnier family in Poitiers was considered too famous, too respected for such stories. The first rooms yielded nothing. The house looked calm and orderly. Everything stood in its place. Things were not touched. No traces of fuss or haste. It was an ordinary house, exactly as they expected to see it. On the third floor there was one door, locked. From under it came a heavy, stagnant smell, which was impossible to confuse with a household one. It did not hit immediately, but seemed to accumulate in the throat with every breath. The policeman stopped at the door and demanded it be opened. Until this moment, Louise Monnier had held herself calmly, but now something changed in her face, almost imperceptibly, for a second, but enough for it to catch the eye.
She tried to stop what was happening, explaining that behind the door was just a storage room, old things that no one had touched for a long time. The policeman did not retreat. The lock did not withstand. The door gave way. The smell stood like a solid wall. It was at this moment that Marcel Monnier appeared in the house. He returned unexpectedly and found the police already on the third floor. A tall, well-groomed man, accustomed to speaking confidently and looking directly. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Marcel intervened without shouting, but firmly. He questioned what was happening, reminded of the law and that such actions are not committed without a warrant. The policeman did not enter into a dispute. He pointed to the door. A pause ensued. Louise and Marcel exchanged glances, quickly, almost imperceptibly. There was no panic in this look. Marcel spoke calmly and confidently. He spoke of a possible mistake, that everything could be settled without noise, of people and connections who do not like such situations. The policeman stood his ground. Louise said that the key to the door had long been lost, that the room had not been opened for many years, that inside were only things spoiled by time. The policeman made a decision. He sent his partner for reinforcements and for the commissioner. To act further without a senior officer meant taking on too much responsibility. The wait stretched for almost an hour. Louise and Marcel remained nearby.
They did not argue and did not fuss. They simply stood and waited. When reinforcements arrived, the commissioner was with them. He wanted to see everything personally. The policeman returned to the door. Procedures were followed strictly and without concessions. The commissioner pressed a handkerchief to his face and took a step forward. On the threshold, he froze. For several seconds, he peered inside. Then he turned around and went back out into the corridor to give the first orders. The commissioner's first order was to call a doctor, then to block the exits and entrances from the house. After that, they began to record everything that was happening. The commissioner returned to the door and entered inside. The room was small, about 3 by 4 meters. The only window turned out to be boarded up from both sides. The shutters were closed tightly. Daylight had not penetrated here for many years. Inside stood a dense darkness. The floor was covered with a layer of rotten straw. It was a compressed mass of straw, rags, food remnants, and traces of vital activity.
The layer had accumulated for a long time. Cleaning in this room had not been conducted. The smell inside was so heavy that one of the policemen who entered afterwards could not stand it and went back out into the corridor. In the middle of the room, on this straw, lay a woman. Her condition spoke for itself. Skin tightly covered bones. Ribs protruded distinctly. Limbs seemed disproportionately thin.
On the face, only the eyes stood out, large, deeply sunken. She had no proper clothing on, only shreds of fabric that might once have been a nightgown. Long matted hair had clumped into a dense ball and partially covered her face and shoulders. She was alive. This became noticeable by a barely improved movement. She tried to turn away from the light, which caused her pain. The commissioner approached closer. He crouched beside her and tried to speak to her. The woman did not answer. She made unintelligible sounds in which it was impossible to distinguish words. He turned to the exit. In the doorway stood Louise Monnier. She looked at what was happening without a visible reaction, without tears, without signs of confusion. The commissioner asked a question about the woman's identity. After a short pause, Louise reported that this was her daughter, Blanche Monnier. Silence fell in the room. The policemen exchanged glances. The name was familiar to everyone. Blanche Monnier was considered to have departed from life more than 20 years ago. Mourning was worn for her. Her passing had long become part of the city's memory. She was here, all this time, in this house. The doctor arrived in about half an hour. He examined the woman on the spot. Moving her immediately was dangerous. Her condition was extremely critical. The results of the examination were recorded in the protocol. The patient's weight was about 25 kilograms. For an adult woman, this meant an extreme degree of emaciation. Nutrition had been irregular and minimal, sufficient only to maintain life. It was impossible to determine age by appearance. She had spent almost half her life in this room. The doctor also noted the mental state. The woman did not react to questions, did not orient herself in what was happening. Years of isolation and total darkness had led to severe disorders. The commissioner returned to Louise Monnier. Now he was interested in details. How many years Blanche had been in the room? Who knew of her existence? Who brought her food? The answers were brief. Blanche had been here for a long time. Outsiders did not know. The mother herself brought food. The reasons for what was happening were designated as family ones. Marcel Monnier kept to the side all this time. He watched what was happening silently. When attention turned to him, he made it clear that his mother should not answer further questions without legal protection. That same evening, Louise Monnier was detained and taken to the station for interrogation. Marcel was not arrested yet, but was obliged to remain in the city. Blanche was transported to the hospital. Slowly and carefully. She did not understand what was happening. Light caused a sharp reaction in her. The presence of people frightened her. She tried to hide and close herself off from the surrounding world. Information about the find quickly spread through the city. By the morning of the next day, newspapers across the country were writing about the incident. The reputation of the Monnier family collapsed in a matter of hours. The woman, considered a model of piety, turned out to be at the center of a case about the multi-year imprisonment of her own daughter. Louise Monnier became the first and main suspect in a story that soon received national resonance. Newspapers called the incident the case of the century. For the investigation, loud headlines were just background. It was necessary to sort out the details, to understand how such a thing could even happen over the course of 25 years, and most importantly, who else was involved. Louise Monnier held herself confidently at the interrogations. She gave her first testimony on May 26, 1901, in the building of the Poitiers Police Department. She did not deny the obvious. Blanche was indeed in the locked room, but she insisted that she acted alone. It was her decision, her responsibility. No one else knew. The investigators did not believe a single word. The Monnier house was large, 3 floors, many rooms. Maintaining such a household alone is impossible. Over 25 years, dozens of servants passed through this house, cooks, maids, gardeners. Someone among them must have noticed something. Interrogations of the servants began, those who could be found. They took place in late May and early June 1901 at the Poitiers Gendarmerie and in the District Court building.
The first to be interrogated was the woman who worked in the house at the time of Blanche's discovery. She had served the Monniers for about 2 years. To the question about the third floor, she answered immediately. It was forbidden to go up there, categorically. Madame Monnier cleaned the upper rooms herself, carried food there herself, carried out what needed to be carried out herself. The investigator asked if this seemed strange to her. The woman shrugged. She explained that it seemed unusual to her, but not exceptional. She needed a job. Madame Monnier paid regularly. In rich houses, according to her, the masters always have their quirks. Her task was to perform duties and not ask unnecessary questions. Separately, the investigation was interested in sounds. The woman confirmed that noises sometimes came from the third floor at night. Moans, sometimes screams. She approached Madame Monnier with this. She explained that an elderly relative with a severe disorder lived upstairs, who should not be disturbed. This version figured in other protocols as well. Several more former servants were found. Their testimonies were similar. Everyone was forbidden to go upstairs. Everyone heard strange sounds. Everyone received the same explanation. One of the maids, interrogated on June 2, 1901, said that she once went up the stairs anyway, out of curiosity. She did not reach the door. Halfway up, she was stopped by Madame Monnier. That same day, the maid was fired.
Without explanations and without a letter of recommendation, after this incident, there were no more such attempts. But there was one person who knew more than the others, and this person was not a servant. Marcel Monnier lived in this house. Not permanently. He had his own apartment in Poitiers where he received clients. But he regularly visited his mother, stayed overnight, had lunch and dinner at the family table. He went up to the third floor. The investigation established this during the verification of testimonies. Several witnesses saw him walking up the stairs. One of the former servants reported bumping into Marcel when he was coming out of the third floor corridor. Marcel explained nothing then and walked past. Marcel Monnier was summoned for interrogation on June 3, 1901. He appeared accompanied by a colleague lawyer. He held himself calmly, answered measuredly. To the question of whether he knew about the existence of his sister in the locked room, Marcel answered evasively. He said that his mother managed the household independently, that he did not interfere in her affairs, that he had his own life, his own career, his own concerns. The investigators reminded him of the servants' testimonies and that he had been seen on the third floor. Marcel did not deny that he went up there. He claimed that he did not enter that room and did not know exactly what was happening there. His mother's explanations, according to him, were the same as for the servants. Marcel also insisted that his sister was considered to have departed from life. He was present at the mourning events. For him, Blanche had ceased to exist many years ago. However, the case materials indicated otherwise. The investigation possessed testimonies about Marcel's regular visits to the third floor, mother's illness. Marcel Monnier knew and remained silent. A week after Louise's detention, in early June 1901, Marcel was arrested. He was charged with complicity. The investigation concluded that the crime was committed not by one person. Mother and son acted together. One held Blanche locked up, the other provided cover. Marcel's arrest caused an even greater resonance than Louise's arrest, because Marcel was a lawyer, a person connected with the law. And for 25 years he knew what was happening in this house. The public demanded explanations. The incident caused bewilderment even among those who had known the Monnier family for many years. At the interrogation, which took place a few days after the arrest, Louise Monnier laid out her version of events, a version which, in her opinion, should have explained everything. Blanche, according to Louise, was mentally ill. This began back in her youth, long before the imprisonment. She had attacks. She became sharp, unpredictable, dangerous to herself and others. She screamed, could break things. Doctors who were invited to the house alleged they gave no hope. No treatment existed. Isolation was named as the only option. Louise said she had no other choice. She claimed she could not give her daughter to an asylum. In the late 19th century, such institutions had a heavy reputation. Patients were kept in harsh conditions, without prospect of improvement. According to her, she could not allow Blanche to end up there. Therefore, as she explained, the decision was made to keep the daughter at home, under supervision, in isolation.
Yes, in difficult conditions, but according to her version, this was a way to protect both Blanche and those around her. Louise spoke about this calmly. She described the years spent in such a regime as a heavy burden, said that she went up to the third floor daily, brought food, endured screams and resistance. According to her, she lived in constant tension, sacrificing herself for the sake of the family. The investigators listened to this version and began to check it point by point. The first was the question about doctors. If Blanche was indeed observed by specialists, names, records, conclusions should have remained. Louise claimed that the doctors were long gone and documents had not been preserved. Then followed the question about the conditions of detention: a room without light, absence of a bed, rotten straw, complete lack of care.
Extreme degree of exhaustion. Louise explained this by the fact that Blanche did not accept help. According to her, the daughter did not allow herself to be washed, tore clothes, refused food. However, these explanations did not match what was recorded during the inspection. The woman found in the room showed no aggression. She almost did not move, reacted to people with fear, tried to hide, not attack. The sounds she made were weak and monotonous. She posed no danger to anyone. The medical examination conducted at the hospital revealed no signs of congenital mental illness. Mental disorders were recorded, but their nature pointed to the consequences of prolonged isolation. The destruction of personality occurred after the imprisonment. The physical condition also contradicted Louise's version. Blanche did not refuse food. She was fed irregularly and in minimal volume. This was enough only to maintain life. As the testimonies were verified, it became clear that Louise's version did not explain what was happening. Investigators began to look for another reason, not related to illness. Conversations with old-timers of Poitiers quickly led to the events of the 1870s. The story of Monsieur Beauvoir surfaced almost immediately. A lawyer without a fortune, a romance that caused sharp rejection from the mother, a conflict that was never resolved. These details did not fit into the version of care and isolation out of necessity. Blanche was deprived of freedom not because of illness. She was locked up after a conflict with her mother, after a refusal to submit, after an attempt to independently choose her life. 25 years in a locked room became not a temporary measure, but a prolonged detention that continued year after year. At the interrogations, Louise showed no remorse. She continued to insist on her rightness and did not change her testimony. By this moment, the investigation possessed a sufficient volume of materials to continue the case further. Versions were compared, facts were checked. The work was not yet completed. During the search of the house on the Street de la Visitation, investigators seized personal belongings of the Monnier family. Among them were letters and notes kept in the study of the late Émile Monnier. Louise had not destroyed them. Either she did not attach importance to them, or she was sure that no one would return to these papers. These documents allowed the reconstruction of events that until then existed only as assumptions. Among the seized materials, Blanche's letters were found, unsent, written in the first months of isolation and preserved in the house. In them she addressed Monsieur Beauvais, wrote about her feelings, about hope for a meeting, that what was happening could not last forever, that justice would triumph anyway. The handwriting in the early letters was even and confident. Blanche wrote as a person who counts on the future. She described plans to leave Poitiers.
Spoke of a new life away from the family, of the desire to start everything anew. These letters conveyed the state of a person who had not yet lost hope and considered what was happening temporary. Not one of them was ever sent. The investigation established that all of Blanche's correspondence was intercepted. Monsieur Beauvais received not a single letter after her disappearance. He thought she had left. Then, that she was seriously ill. Later, that she was gone. All this time, Blanche was in the same house and continued to write. Later notes looked different. These were short texts on scraps of paper. The handwriting became uneven, sometimes almost illegible. Blanche wrote in the dark, not seeing the paper. The source of these sheets could not be established. Presumably, she used any available scraps. The content of these notes changed. Plans disappeared. Appeals to the future disappeared. Requests for help and questions without answers remained. She wrote of the desire to leave the room,
of readiness to submit to any demands. These texts reflected the gradual destruction of her mental state. Investigators drew attention to the sequence of changes. In early notes, protest and expectation prevailed. In later ones, pleas. Then, fragmentary phrases and separate words. This coincided with medical conclusions about Blanche's condition. Additionally, Louise Monnier's correspondence with her acquaintances, dated to the 1870s, was discovered.
In these letters, she discussed the situation with her daughter in detail. She called Monsieur Beauvais a man having neither fortune nor position, wrote that Blanche's infatuation threatened the family's honor, claimed that she was obliged to prevent this union at any cost. The phrase "at any cost" was encountered repeatedly. Louise viewed what was happening as a struggle for the reputation of the lineage. She referred to the memory of her late husband and to public opinion. For her, Blanche's possible marriage meant public disgrace. In one of the reply letters, a friend expressed doubts. She cautiously wrote that the measures might be excessive and that over time the infatuation might pass by itself. Louise rejected this advice. In her reply, she indicated that one could not wait, that Blanche was stubborn and would not retreat, that the only way to stop the connection was to completely isolate the daughter from the outside world, temporarily, until she changed her decision. This temporarily stretched for 25 years. The investigation also established the fate of Monsieur Beauvais. He continued to live in Poitiers for many years after Blanche's disappearance, did not marry, worked as a lawyer, maintained a modest practice, periodically inquired about her fate but received no answers. Those around were sure that Blanche had long not been among the living. Monsieur Beauvais passed away in 1885 due to heart disease.
He never found out that the woman he loved was a few blocks away from him and wrote him letters all this time. The person because of whom the imprisonment began departed from life long before its end. After 1885, the reasons Louise cited no longer existed. The door on the third floor remained closed. After Monsieur Beauvais was gone, the imprisonment continued for another 16 years. These years no longer had an explanation related to preventing a marriage. What was happening was maintained by inertia. At interrogations, Louise was asked why she did not end the isolation after Monsieur Beauvais's passing. It was recorded in the protocol that she considered release impossible. According to her, Blanche could no longer live a normal life, and her appearance in public would mean revealing what had happened and a public scandal. Continuing the isolation was viewed as a safer option. The investigation continued its work. Documents were systematized, testimonies compared. In parallel, at the Poitiers hospital, doctors tried to stabilize Blanche Monnier's condition and return her to life after 25 years of isolation. Blanche's condition at the time of admission was extremely critical. The patient, weighing about 25 kilograms, could not stand on her own, barely tolerated lighting, and almost did not react to speech addressed to her. The woman had spent 25 years in conditions of prolonged isolation and extreme exhaustion.
The first days were devoted to stabilizing her condition. Treatment was led by the duty doctor of the Poitiers hospital, Dr. Moreau, who had experience working with severe forms of exhaustion. Food was introduced gradually, in small portions. Blanche's body had not received proper food for a long time and was not capable of accepting a normal ration immediately. Doctors acted cautiously, fearing complications related to a sharp change in diet. Lighting in the ward was kept minimal. Blanche's vision was adapted to the prolonged absence of light. Even weak light caused a pronounced reaction in her. She turned away, covered her face, made drawn-out sounds. Medical personnel recorded this as a reaction to a stimulus, not conscious behavior. After primary stabilization, a medical examination was appointed. The investigation required an official conclusion on the physical and mental state of Blanche Monnier. This document had fundamental importance for the further investigation. The examination was conducted by a commission of 3 doctors. 2 specialized in internal diseases, the third was a psychiatrist. The psychiatric examination was supervised by Dr. Jules Bergier, who practiced in Poitiers and collaborated with judicial bodies. The observation took place over several days. All observations were recorded in medical documentation. The physical condition was assessed as extremely critical. Doctors diagnosed cachexia, a pronounced form of wasting. Muscle mass was sharply reduced. Subcutaneous fat tissue was practically absent.
The skin was thinned, with signs of chronic inflammatory processes. Hair, brittle and sparse. The function of internal organs was impaired. Cardiac activity remained unstable. The liver and kidneys functioned with signs of a prolonged overload state. All indicators pointed to chronic malnutrition, continuing not for months, but for years. Separately, a psychiatric examination was conducted. It was necessary to verify Louise Monier's claims about the presence of a mental illness in her daughter before isolation. The psychiatrist observed the patient in dynamics: reactions, the ability to orient oneself, the preservation of basic functions were assessed. It was established that Blanche did not orient herself in time and space, did not recognize those around her, did not realize the situation. Speech was fragmentary, with repeating sounds and separate words. At the same time, the nature of the disorders pointed to their acquired origin. In his conclusion, Dr. Bergier emphasized that such a picture is typical for people who have been in conditions of sensory deprivation for a long time. Absence of light, communication, change of environment leads to the gradual destruction of cognitive functions. The human brain needs constant external stimulation. In its absence, neural connections degrade, memory loses structure, thinking becomes disjointed.
These processes were described in detail in the medical part of the conclusion. Blanche had been in conditions of total isolation for 25 years. Contact with the outside world was minimal and brief. This turned out to be insufficient to preserve mental integrity. The conclusion separately noted that signs of congenital or early mental illness were not detected. All recorded disorders were explained by the conditions of detention. The patient's condition was viewed as a consequence, not as the initial cause of isolation. Doctors also recorded the preservation of certain basic reactions. Blanche reacted to food, distinguished touches, sometimes tried to reproduce words. This indicated that despite severe disorders, part of the functions remained. The expert conclusion was prepared in early June 1901 and signed by members of the commission, including Dr. Moreau and Dr. Bergier, after which it was transferred to the investigative bodies. The document contained a detailed description of the patient's condition and did not allow for double interpretation. At the same time, work continued in the hospital to maintain Blanche's condition. Doctors did not count on the restoration of lost mental functions. Their task boiled down to stabilizing the physical condition and providing care of which she had been deprived for many years. While doctors dealt with Blanche's condition, the investigation continued its work.
One question gave no rest to either the police or the city authorities or the residents of Poitiers. How could such a thing exist for 25 years in the center of the city and remain unnoticed? Could it be that during all this time, no one suspected that something abnormal was happening? Investigators decided to check this line separately. Repeated surveys of neighbors living next to the Monnier house were conducted. Merchants who regularly supplied products were questioned. Postmen serving this quarter. People who for years encountered the family in everyday life and could have seen or heard something. The results turned out to be unequivocal and disturbing. Many noticed oddities in the Monnier house. A neighbor living through the wall testified that from time to time she heard sounds from the upper floors, dull thuds, sometimes drawn-out moans, most often at night. She could not determine the source, but understood that these were not ordinary household noises of an old house. Once, many years ago, she cautiously mentioned this in a conversation with Madame Monnier. Louise reacted calmly and without irritation. She explained that an elderly relative with a severe illness lived in the house. The condition was serious, suffering was inevitable, doctors could not help. Only care and prayer remained. After that, the conversation was not raised again. The neighbor considered the topic closed. A resident of the house opposite noticed something else.
The shutters on the third floor never opened, neither in summer nor in winter. He asked a question to the gardener working for the Monniers. He replied that the mistress did not wish anyone to look upstairs. Personal belongings of the late master of the house were kept there, and interference was considered inadmissible. The explanation seemed strange, but no one asked further questions.
The merchant delivering products noted that deliveries were carried out regularly and without interruptions. He did not track in what volume the products were consumed and did not take an interest in who exactly received them. He had no grounds for questions then. Former servants, interrogated repeatedly, confirmed their earlier testimonies. Everyone knew that the third floor was closed. Everyone heard sounds. Some smelled the odor that sometimes reached the lower floors, but no one took action. One of the maids, who served in the house in the early 1890s, admitted that she seriously thought about going to the police. Noises from the third floor caused her anxiety, but she abandoned this thought, fearing consequences. Accusations could turn out to be erroneous. The mistress's reputation was impeccable. Any complaint could destroy her own life. She preferred silence, like the others. The investigation faced a fact that could not be ignored. Over 25 years, dozens of people noticed alarming signs: closed shutters, forbidden rooms, night sounds, discrepancies in everyday details.
And not a single person went beyond doubts. The reason lay in the social structure of the city. The Monnier family occupied a privileged position. Money, connections, reputation, participation in church and charitable life created a zone of inaccessibility around them. For servants and merchants, their word had no weight. For neighbors, interference meant conflict with an influential family. For people from the same circle, the risk of a scandal, which they preferred to avoid. Louise Monnier understood this and acted based on this knowledge. She relied not on locks and threats, but on fear, the habit of not interfering, and the confidence of those around that such a thing simply could not happen in such a house. Over 25 years, not a single official signal reached the police, until one anonymous letter. The investigation tried to establish its author. Handwriting comparisons were conducted. Samples of writing from former servants, acquaintances of the family, people who had access to the house were checked. Paper and ink were analyzed. This yielded no results. The author of the letter was never established. Whoever he was, it was this person who broke the years of silence. One sentence on a sheet of paper proved sufficient to stop what had continued for a quarter of a century. From the point of view of the law, neighbors and servants bore no criminal liability. The law of that time did not provide for punishment for failure to report suspicions.
Formally, they violated nothing. Factually, however, their silence became part of the mechanism that allowed the crime to exist for so long. These testimonies were attached to the case materials. They did not change the composition of the charge, but supplemented the general picture. They showed how fear, social inequality, and the habit of not interfering can work just as effectively as a locked door. The investigators proceeded from the fact that a description of events alone was insufficient. For the court, it was necessary to understand who Louise Monnier was as a person and how she could come to such actions. Investigators began to look into her past, upbringing, and family relationships. For this, distant relatives, old acquaintances, and people who knew Louise even before her marriage were questioned. These testimonies allowed the reconstruction of character traits that previously remained out of sight. Louise Monnier, née Duval, came from a family with pronounced social ambitions. Her parents did not belong to high society, but attached exceptional importance to position, external well-being, and the opinion of others. From an early age, it was instilled in Louise that reputation is more important than personal feelings, and that any deviation from accepted norms is perceived as a threat. Marriage to Émile Monnier became a significant step up for her. Dean of the university, an established surname, recognition in the city.
After marriage, Louise quickly took a leading position in the family and ran the household rigidly and consistently. Relatives on her husband's side noted her demanding nature and implacability. Everything in the house had to correspond to the order established by her. Any deviations were perceived as inadmissible. This especially concerned the children. Émile Monnier's cousin, who lived in a neighboring town, gave detailed testimony. According to her, Louise raised Marcel and Blanche in conditions of strict discipline, where the main requirement was unconditional submission. Independent decisions were not encouraged. Objections were suppressed. The witness recalled an episode that occurred when Blanche was still very young. The girl asked for permission to go for a walk with friends. Having received a refusal, she tried to insist. In response, Louise locked her in a room for several days, limiting food.
This case did not cause intervention from adults then. The episode occurred long before the story with Monsieur Beauvais, but it showed an already formed method of influence. Isolation was used as a means of punishment and suppression. Émile Monnier, according to testimonies, practically did not interfere in upbringing. He was busy with university work and left the running of the house to his wife. The investigation received no information that he made attempts to change the situation. Former servants who worked in the house even during Émile's life supplemented this picture.
They noted that Louise never raised her voice and did not make scenes. Orders were given calmly and without discussion. The atmosphere in the house was tense. The servants tried not to attract attention to themselves. Marcel, according to witnesses' recollections, chose a line of complete submission. He followed his mother's instructions in matters of study, career, and personal life. Several women showed interest in him, but it did not come to marriage. Louise did not approve of any of the possible candidates, and Marcel agreed with this. One of Marcel's colleagues in legal practice reported that he maintained constant contact with his mother and did not make important decisions without her approval. Such behavior seemed unusual for an adult and independent man, but did not go beyond the bounds of the permissible until the circumstances of the case became known. The investigation concluded that Marcel knew about what was happening in the house. He visited the third floor, heard sounds, and could not help but understand what was happening there. However, he took no action. His behavior fit into the model of submission formed since childhood. Based on the collected testimonies, it was concluded that what happened was not a sudden breakdown or an accidental act. It was a continuation of Louise Monnier's stable behavior model built on control and suppression. The psychiatrist consulting the investigation compiled a conclusion on the personality of the accused.
It used formulations characteristic of medical practice of the early 20th century, a pronounced need for control, inability to recognize the autonomy of other people, extreme dependence of self-esteem on external recognition. In this context, the children were viewed by Louise not as independent personalities, but as part of her own image. Blanche's attempt to make an independent decision was perceived as a violation of the established order. These materials did not change the essence of the charges, but helped to understand how and why all this became possible. The investigation continued work, and new circumstances appeared one after another. One of the key stages of the investigation was the repeated interrogation of Marcel Monnier. The first time he held himself confidently, limiting himself to legal formulations and evasive answers. Now the investigation possessed materials that left no room for maneuver. The interrogation took place in mid-June 1901 in the building of the Poitiers District Court. Marcel arrived with a lawyer. Formally, everything looked like a standard procedure, but the nature of the conversation changed immediately. The investigator began not with questions but with documents. Laid out on the table were photographs of the room on the third floor, medical conclusions, and protocols of servants' interrogations. There was nothing new for the investigation in these materials. What was new was that now they were being reviewed in Marcel's presence. The investigator invited him to familiarize himself with the documents and asked a direct question about whether this place was familiar to him. Marcel stated that he was seeing the images for the first time. Then fragments of the servants' testimonies were read out, not in general form, but specifically those where Marcel's presence on the third floor and his participation in carrying food were mentioned. One of the protocols concerned an episode when he was seen leaving the corridor with an empty tray. After this, Marcel stopped answering immediately. He looked at the papers for a long time, not raising his eyes. An attempt by the lawyer to intervene was cut short. The investigator made it clear that the conversation was not about formalities, but about facts that were already recorded. The pause dragged on. Then Marcel admitted that he knew about what was happening from the very beginning, from the moment his mother made the decision to lock Blanche up. He confirmed that he understood where his sister was and in what conditions she lived. He explained that since childhood he was used to obeying his mother and never perceived the possibility of going against her as real. He initially perceived the decision on imprisonment as temporary. When it became clear that it would not be revoked, he continued to remain silent.
Marcel confirmed that in separate periods, at his mother's request, he went up to the third floor and passed food.
He avoided contact with his sister and tried not to linger in the room. He made no attempts to change the situation and told no one about it. He explained the reasons for his silence by fear and dependence. Fear of his mother, of a public scandal, and of the destruction of his own life. He admitted that he understood what was happening, but preferred not to take responsibility. To the question of who made the initial decision, Marcel pointed to his mother. He stated that he acted according to her will and did not view himself as a person capable of changing the situation. The testimony was recorded in the protocol. Marcel admitted awareness and his participation in concealing what was happening, while insisting that the initiative came entirely from Louise Monnier. The investigation took these testimonies into account. They clarified the distribution of roles and confirmed complicity, but did not remove responsibility from Marcel himself. The investigation did not stop, but attention increasingly shifted to Louise Monnier herself. With every day, it became noticeable that her condition was rapidly deteriorating, and this was beginning to influence the course of the case. The investigation, nevertheless, continued work in all directions. While some investigators dealt with interrogations and drafting protocols, others sorted through papers seized in the Monnier house. Blanche's letters and personal notes had already been sorted and described. Next came household documents, stacked separately. Among them, the family's accounting notebooks. These were thick notebooks with neat handwriting, years on the covers, entries made without haste. Louise Monnier managed finances carefully. Groceries, clothes, servants' wages, repairs, donations, everything was recorded line by line. The accounting began in the early 1870s and broke off in May 1901. At first, these notebooks looked like the ordinary bookkeeping of a wealthy house. Dates, sums, names of shops and suppliers. But upon comparing entries for different years, a discrepancy arose. In entries before 1876, expenses included all family members, clothes for Blanche, studies, books, music lessons, expenses characteristic of a house where adult children live. After 1876, Blanche's name disappeared. The investigator checked records for the following years, 1877, 1878, the early 1880s, then the 1890s. Not a single line related to Blanche Monnier. Expenses for Marcel continued to be recorded in detail and regularly. His life was reflected in the notebooks completely. Blanche no longer existed in these records. Attempts to find hidden designations or other forms of accounting yielded no result. There were no separate categories, no alternative names either. She simply disappeared from the bookkeeping. At the same time, the total volume of expenses for food after 1876 remained practically unchanged.
The house purchased bread, meat, and milk in the same quantities, based on the needs of the mistress, son, and servants. Separate costs for one more person did not appear. This coincided with the testimonies of doctors and servants. Blanche was not fed separately. She got what remained from the common table. There were no records of buying clothes for her at all. For the entire period of imprisonment, not one. This corresponded to the state of the rags in which she was discovered. Medical expenses related to Blanche were also absent. For 25 years, Louise never called a doctor to her daughter and did not purchase medicines for her. At the same time, Louise recorded her own visits to doctors and expenses for treatment diligently. The investigator drew up an analytical note. There were no evaluations or assumptions in it, only compared data and the chronology of records. The accounting notebooks showed everyday practice. Year after year, they reflected the needs of all family members except one. This excluded accident and error. It was about a prolonged, stable order of things. Special attention was drawn to records for the years after Monsieur Beauvais was gone. After 1885, nothing changed in the household. Expenses remained the same. Blanche still did not appear in a single item. Financial documents were attached to the case materials. They supplemented medical conclusions and witness testimonies, relying on no one's words or memories.
These notebooks were filled by the hand of Blanche Monnier. The entries went evenly, year after year, without gaps or failures. Everything that concerned the life of the house was accounted for in them. One name was not in these records. People began to speak about the Blanche Monnier case aloud, at first cautiously, in fragments, as of something so terrible that it was awkward to pronounce it fully. People retold what they heard to each other, stumbling, confusing details, returning to the same question: how could such a thing happen for so many years and remain unnoticed? Newspapers picked up the story almost immediately. Reporters camped at the police department and the courthouse, tried to get clerks to talk, caught neighbors, looked for former servants. Any new detail instantly turned into a note, any assumption into a loud headline. Some publications allowed themselves conjectures, others tried to stick to facts, but even dry information produced the effect of a blow. Photographs of the room on the third floor were printed again and again. Blurry, grainy shots taken in poor lighting acted more strongly than any descriptions. People examined them for a long time, returning their gaze to the same details, trying to understand how one could live in such a place even for a day, let alone decades. In Poitiers, people began to gather at the Monnier house, at first out of curiosity, then out of anger.
Someone simply stood and looked at the facade, trying to reconcile the neat appearance of the house with what they now knew about it. Others shouted insults. Several times stones flew into the windows. The police had to post a guard so the crowd would not tear the building apart. Anger was directed not only at Louise and Marcel. People remembered neighbors who heard sounds, servants who worked in the house, priests who visited there for years. Everyone tried to find the guilty not only among the accused, but also around themselves. Indignation mixed with an awkward feeling of complicity. The city, which had long preferred not to ask questions, now spoke too loudly. Letters from readers began to arrive at newspaper editorial offices. People wrote about fear, about sleepless nights, about the fact that after reading the articles it was difficult for them to look at their own houses and families the same way as before. Some demanded severe punishment, others limited themselves to words of horror and bewilderment. Almost every letter sounded the same thing, an attempt to comprehend how such a thing became possible. Women reacted especially acutely. Mothers wrote that they could not accept the very idea of what had happened. They imagined themselves in Louise's place and found no explanations. For many, this story destroyed the habitual idea of the family as a safe space. The church found itself in a difficult position.
Blanche Monnier had been considered a model parishioner for years. She donated money, regularly appeared at services, enjoyed respect. Now priests had to answer questions to which they had no convincing answers. The majority preferred cautious formulations and silence. The reputation of the family, built over decades, crumbled in a matter of days. The name Monnier, previously sounded with reverence, began to cause disgust. What Louise feared most, public disgrace, overtook her in a form she could not have conceived. Louise herself was in the prison hospital of Poitiers. Her condition was deteriorating. She almost did not eat, slept poorly, complained of chest pains. Doctors recorded signs of heart failure and insisted on rest, but there was no rest. Even behind closed doors, she remained the center of attention. News reached her in fragments: guards' conversations, remarks of medical staff, scraps of newspaper phrases. She knew what was happening outside, knew how she was being spoken of, knew what her name had turned into. According to those who saw her in these days, she did not speak of her daughter, did not recall Blanche, did not ask questions about her condition. All her thoughts were focused on one thing, on the fact that everything she lived for had collapsed. In mid-June 1901, Blanche Monnier had a severe heart attack. It happened at night during a routine round. She was found lying on the floor unconscious. Doctors arrived quickly, but the condition was critical. She was transferred to a separate room and placed under constant observation. She regained consciousness for a short time, spoke with difficulty, in short phrases, and even then, according to the testimonies of medics, she never spoke of what she had done, not about her daughter, not about guilt, only about herself and what had happened to her name. The investigation was informed that the accused might not live to see the trial. Any deterioration could be the last. Society demanded a trial. Newspapers wrote that Louise Monnier should not leave without answering for what had happened. But time and age were stronger than the demands of the crowd. The heart of the woman who had kept another's life under control for a quarter of a century now refused to obey her herself. While doctors fought for Louise Monnier's life, the investigation continued work. It was necessary to understand exactly how all this worked, not in general, but day by day. What happened behind that door and how it could continue for years. In mid-June 1901, investigators returned to the house on the Street de la Visitation with a different task: to reconstruct the everyday reality of what happened behind the closed door. For this, a repeated and detailed inspection of the room on the third floor was conducted, as well as questioning of everyone who might know the routine of the house.
Investigators worked methodically, recording every detail, every trace, every element from which this isolated reality was formed. The room was cramped, so much so that there was no space left in it either for movement or for privacy. The only window was boarded up from both sides, from the outside so that no one could look inside, from the inside so that the person inside could not knock them out even if desired. The shutters remained closed for years, metal on the hinges rusted, wood swelled from moisture. Investigators checked if at least some light penetrated inside. The experiment was conducted during the day, in clear weather, when the sun stood high. This was recorded in the inspection protocol. The result turned out to be unequivocal. Even at clear noon, complete darkness remained in the room, not the slightest glimmer. One of the investigators instinctively took a step back, as if expecting his eyes to adjust. This did not happen. The door was the most ordinary one, not skewed, not damaged, without traces of attempted break-in. On the jamb remained marks in the same place, where the hand with the key stopped every time. These traces did not appear by chance. They remained year after year from the same movement. The door was not forgotten or abandoned. It was opened regularly within the framework of an established order. This is how one opens a door to a room about which one does not reflect and which one has long ceased to treat as something unusual. On the floor was a layer of what was once straw. Experts established that it ceased to perform the function of bedding back in the first years of imprisonment. Everything that happened later simply accumulated on top of the already existing layer. Over time, it turned into a dense mass soaked in organic residues. In some places, its thickness reached several centimeters. Cleaning in the room was not conducted. This was confirmed by both the inspection and the testimonies of former servants. The walls were covered with mold, dirt, and traces of moisture. Plaster crumbled in places, exposing brick. Corners were covered by dense cobwebs. Insects moved freely around the room. Even after Blanche was taken away, the room remained unsuitable for work for several days. The space itself turned out to be infected by the conditions in which the person existed in it. Investigators reconstructed the feeding order. Servants' testimonies coincided. Once a day, usually in the evening after dinner, Louise went up to the third floor with a tray. On it were food scraps from the table, crusts of bread, leftovers, cold porridge or soup, sometimes only water and a piece of stale bread. Additional food was never prepared. If everything was eaten at the table, the portion turned out to be minimal. If more remained, she got a little more. According to servants, sometimes hours passed between steps on the stairs and the opening of the door. For the person in the room, this was the only time reference. Louise opened the door, put the tray on the floor, took the dishes from the previous feeding, and left. Everything happened silently and took less than a minute. She did not talk to her daughter and did not check her condition. It was a mechanical action repeated day after day. In rare cases, when Louise could not go up the stairs, this duty was performed by Marcel. His actions completely repeated his mother's actions. He did not linger and avoided looking inside. Contact with his sister was completely absent. Blanche's clothes were not changed. What was on her at the moment of discovery were the remains of a dress put on in 1876. Over 25 years, the fabric decayed and fell apart. In winter, it was cold in the room. Heating did not reach there. In summer, stuffy and humid. The possibility to change conditions did not exist. She was not allowed to wash. There was neither water nor hygiene items in the room.
Her skin was covered with a layer of dirt ingrained over years, hair matted into a dense ball which had to be cut off in the hospital. She relieved natural needs directly onto the straw. Other options did not exist. Over time, the floor turned into a layer of organic waste. In these conditions, she slept, ate, and existed for years. Any objects were absent in the room. No books, no paper, no fabric, no tools. Complete isolation from stimuli. Darkness, silence, loneliness. The only event of the day remained the brief opening of the door. Doctors consulting the investigation indicated that in such conditions, the human brain gradually loses the ability to function. Everything that was later described in medical conclusions happened right here, within these walls, day after day. Investigators calculated the duration of the imprisonment, about 9,000 days. 9,000 times the door opened and closed. 9,000 times the decision was made to change nothing. The investigator making the calculation rechecked the figures several times. The result remained the same. The reconstruction showed that this was not a single episode or an outburst of cruelty. It was a system working daily and without failures. Thousands of small actions, each of which maintained conditions incompatible with human life. Louise Monnier could have stopped at any moment. After the first year, after the fifth, after Monsieur Beauvais was gone, after Blanche stopped screaming. But this did not happen even once. The reconstruction was drawn up in the form of a detailed report and formed the basis of the indictment. It described not only the conditions of detention, but also their consequences. This was not simply deprivation of freedom, it was the prolonged and consistent destruction of a person. The case was ready for transfer to court. The question remained whether the main accused would live to the moment when she could hear the verdict.
Louise Monnier did not live to see the trial. She passed away in the Poitiers prison hospital on June 9, 1901, 15 days after her arrest. In the medical conclusion, the cause was indicated as acute heart failure against the background of chronic diseases. The body of the elderly woman, weakened by age and the events of recent weeks, did not withstand. News of her passing spread through the city on the same day. The reaction was mixed. Some said it was a natural outcome, others that she left without answering for what she had done. Parisian and regional newspapers, including Le Petit Parisien and La Croix, reported her death dryly, without comments and without attempts to evoke sympathy. The funeral took place on June 12 at the Poitiers City Cemetery, without announcements, without a crowd, without public speeches. Marcel and several distant relatives were present. The priest limited himself to a short service. The grave was not marked with a monument. The family preferred not to attract attention to the name, which in a few weeks had become a symbol of shame. The woman who had controlled everything around her for decades left quietly and without the opportunity to explain anything. However, the case did not end. The second figure remained. The trial of Marcel Monnier was scheduled for October 9, 1901, and took place in the building of the District Court of the Vienne Department. The hall turned out to be overcrowded.
Residents of Poitiers came. Journalists from Paris, Lyon, and Bordeaux arrived. The gendarmerie watched over order, fearing outbursts of anger. Marcel looked collected. The lawyer, accustomed to being on the other side of the process, now sat on the defendant's bench. He repeated already known testimonies. He knew about the imprisonment, went up to the third floor, sometimes brought food, but decisions were made by his mother. He only obeyed. The defense was led by lawyer Maurice Leblanc. The line was drawn clearly. Marcel did not deprive his sister of freedom, did not determine the conditions of her detention, and did not own the house. His inaction, according to the defense's version, did not fall under criminal liability under current law. Prosecutor Jean-Pierre Duval insisted on the opposite. He spoke of the conscious concealment of a crime, of maintaining a false version of Blanche's departure from life, of regular actions that made the imprisonment possible. Silence over 25 years he called a form of complicity. Hearings lasted 3 days.
The court heard witnesses, studied protocols, medical conclusions, account books, and letters. Everything that was collected by the investigation ended up in the case. On October 11, 1901, the court found Marcel Monnier guilty of complicity in illegal deprivation of freedom and sentenced him to 15 months of imprisonment. The decision caused a sharp reaction.
For many, this term looked disproportionate to what had happened. Discussions did not subside either in Poitiers or beyond its borders. Marcel filed an appeal almost immediately. The Court of Appeal considered the case in November 1901. The defense cited a gap in legislation. At that time, the French Penal Code did not provide for liability for failure to provide assistance to a person in danger. The law did not establish duties to intervene. On November 27, 1901, the verdict was overturned. Marcel Monnier was released. From a formal point of view, he did not violate the law. He did not lock the door, did not board up the windows, did not deprive of food. All these actions were committed by his mother, by that moment already departed from life. His knowledge and years of silence were not considered criminally punishable. The case ended without real punishment. The main culprit did not appear before the court. Her son walked free. For 25 years of imprisonment, not a single person served a sentence. This process became one of the arguments for subsequent changes in French law. Later, a norm was introduced regarding the duty to provide assistance to a person in danger. Blanche Monnier outlived both her mother and brother, and the entire judicial process. But the life that began after her release never became a life in the full sense of the word.
After her condition was stabilized at the Poitiers hospital, Blanche was transferred to a psychiatric clinic in Blois in the Loire Valley. There she spent the next 12 years. Doctors immediately realized that full recovery could not be expected. 25 years in isolation and darkness had destroyed her psyche irreversibly. It was not about returning to her former life, but at least about making her existence less agonizing. And in this, as far as it was generally possible, they achieved a result. Clinic staff later recalled that Blanche reacted to the simplest things: clean sheets, warm water, food served on a plate, not left on the floor, and especially sunlight. She could sit by the window for a long time, not taking her face away from the rays. After a quarter of a century spent in complete darkness, this was a new, almost incomprehensible experience for her. She never returned to coherent speech. Words came to her with difficulty. Phrases broke off, got confused, lost meaning. She did not always recognize people around, did not understand where she was and why. Past and present in her consciousness were not separated, but merged into a single, disordered sensation. Sometimes she addressed nurses by her mother's name. Sometimes she asked to pass a letter to Monsieur Beauvais, not knowing that he had long been gone. There were days when she simply sat motionless, staring at one point, and it was impossible to understand what she was thinking about.
Or if she was thinking at all. Blanche Monnier passed away in the Blois Clinic on October 13, 1913. Of the years lived, she spent 25 in imprisonment and another 12 in a psychiatric institution. Free, in the full sense of the word, she never was. She was buried in the local cemetery, in a modest grave without indication of surname. Not one of the relatives was present at the ceremony. Marcel, by that time, had long left Poitiers and did not maintain ties with his sister. He outlived her by only a few years and departed from life in obscurity, never having managed to restore his reputation. The house on the Street de la Visitation was sold shortly after the conclusion of the process. New owners tried to erase its grim reputation, but unsuccessfully. Local residents called it the House of Horrors for decades more. The building changed hands several times until in the middle of the 20th century it was finally demolished. The Blanche Monnier case went down in history. It is cited in textbooks on criminology as an example of a crime that was hidden for years behind a facade of propriety. Psychiatrists study it as an extreme case of sensory deprivation. Lawyers recall it when speaking of the necessity of intervention when a person is in danger. But one detail remained unknown. The author of the anonymous letter that put an end to the 25-year imprisonment was never established. Someone learned the truth and decided to reveal it.
This person saved Blanche, albeit too late to return a normal life to her. Whoever he was, history has not preserved his name.